is an army of hackers funding North Korea's nuclear program. Washington is convinced Pyongyang is stealing millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrency to fund its nuclear arsenal. I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is North Korea. North Korea is the most isolated nation on Earth, and also one of the most feared. That's because it is run by one of the most unpredictable dictators on Earth. And if that was not terrifying enough, Kim Jong-un also has access to nuclear weapons. But just how is one of the poorest nations on the planet able to fund such a costly and dangerous program? Well, according to the United States, Pyongyang has an army of hackers stealing vast sums worth of cryptocurrency. And Washington is worried.
They use cyber to gain, we estimate, up to a third of their funds to fund their missile program. That's a major issue, whether it's attacks against cryptocurrency exchanges or use of information technology workers in various countries. Clearly, the continued advancements, the number of launches in the North Korean missile program is a priority for us. So given that cyber is such a core driver of revenue, it's something we must address.
So just how much of a threat is North Korea? Kim Jong-un has never been shy about showing off his nuclear arsenal. Just take a look at this recent military display in Pyongyang. And not only does the Hermit Kingdom's leader like to showcase what he has got, he is also happy to let the world know he is willing to use them.
The fundamental mission of our nuclear forces is to deter a war. But our nukes can never be confined to the single mission of war deterrent. Even at a time when a situation we're not desirous of at all is created on this land. If any forces try to violate the fundamental interests of our state, our nuclear forces will have to decisively accomplish its unexpected second mission.
The United States has taken his threat seriously and has warned Kim his actions would have consequences.
I think it is fair to say that the DPRK also won't be surprised to hear the same message from us, and that is our commitment to the defense of the Republic of Korea and Japan, a commitment that remains ironclad. The DPRK, as we've consistently said, constitutes a threat to international peace and security in the global non-proliferation regime.
And joining me now from Seoul, South Korea is Daniel Pinkston. He is an international relations lecturer at Troy University and former Northeast Asia Deputy Project Director for the International Crisis Group. Philip Ingram is in Birmingham. He's a cybersecurity expert and former British military intelligence officer. And in New York is Tom O'Connor, a senior foreign policy writer for Newsweek magazine. Thanks all for being with us today here on The Newsmakers. Philip, I would like to begin with you. Now, of course, North Korea denies these accusations that it has been funding its nuclear program with the help of stolen cryptocurrency. In fact, North Korea calls these accusations U.S. propaganda. But I mean, there is consensus among many experts that this is what's been happening in North Korea for some time now. So tell me, what kind of risk does it pose to the world?
Well, North Korea poses quite a large risk when it comes to stealing money. It's had some major successes. The hack on Sony was a sophisticated attack a few years ago. It targets not just crypto wallets, but it also has some very good scams that are targeting the access to fiat currencies, the normal currencies we have, and they've had bank scams. They've been running it through, one of the primary groups doing it is called the Lazarus Group, that is linked to one of North Korea's government liaison officers. The Lazarus Group is not just physically based inside North Korea. It's got its main element there, but it's got tentacles spread out across the world. And of course, it's easy to buy those tentacles because it makes huge amounts of money. And that's what North Korea uses to fund the lavish lifestyle that Kim Jong-un enjoys, but also to fund their military programs.
Philip, let me add one more question here. Now, crypto market is largely unregulated. Tell me, to what extent do you think the fact that cryptocurrencies are largely unregulated has encouraged or perhaps emboldened North Korea to steal?
Well, it hits all the criminal organizations. I think one of the biggest fallacies out there is that crypto is untrackable. The reality is very different in that every crypto transaction is open and available for everyone in the world to gain access to, apart from one or two coins that are out there. But as the market has exploded and people don't have that understanding, and we've not got the government regulation, there aren't the safety mechanisms in place that you'd find in banks and elsewhere, and therefore that makes it easier for criminals and criminal nation states who want to hack into wallets. They don't actually hack the blockchain, they hack people's wallets and access those wallets to try and steal the currencies that are out there. However, legal precedence is being set, and in particular out of the UK, where you can now get international freezing orders to stop crypto exchanges from then allowing that money to be moved on, and international law enforcement is just waking up to that.
Right, and it's not just the crypto market. North Korea has also been accused of engaging in cyber attacks. In fact, in 2019, sanctions monitors reported that North Korea had generated an estimated $2 billion for its weapons of mass destruction programs using cyber attacks. Tom, could this have been avoided?
It's difficult to say. Of course, with more stringent measures put in place, it would make life more difficult for the North Koreans to engage in this sort of behavior. But of course, there is the motivation on North Korean side is to avoid the sanctions on them. So North Korea will always find ways to invest its resources, state-backed resources, into dodging these sanctions, generating income for the DPRK. And that includes, of course, military, that includes various other parts of the economy, but of course, the nuclear program itself. So it's hard to say how much we can get a concerted world effort to avoid this, given the ingenuity of the North Korean strategy, which is not just about hacking specifically, but also infiltrating the cybersecurity world and the cryptocurrency world. We've seen North Koreans posing as applicants for jobs in cybersecurity and cryptocurrency blockchain companies around the world, trying to penetrate the market from within, and that gives them access to passwords, security flaws, coding, and even legitimacy with email addresses to be able to propagate then within that world. So it's quite a elaborate scheme, and of course this is a state-sponsored operation. At least that's what experts and U.S. officials and UN panels of experts have determined to be. So it would take some concerted effort from more than one nation to be able to counter that.
But Tom, what would be a solution in the short run? Because from what it seems like, sanctions on North Korea are here to stay. For example, in the past few months alone, North Korea has conducted multiple missile tests. In fact, when President Joe Biden was visiting South Korea, right after he departed the country, North Korea fired like 3 missiles into the sea. So certainly it seems like sanctions are here to stay. So how could we move forward in the short run? What could be done so that North Korea stops doing what it's doing right now?
Sure. Well, I mean, to be honest, without any sort of lasting agreement that lifts the sanctions, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to address the scope of the North Korean problem, because North Korea is not the only country in the world engaging in this. We think of the Cold War cloak and dagger days when it comes to espionage and infiltration, which very much still exists. But there's a parallel realm playing out in the cyber world, in the digital world right now. And that's really where North Korea has been able to, as a state entity, invest these sort of resources into that world. So we haven't been able to address this threat when it comes to, of course, Russia, to China yet. We're only really just beginning to address this in the recent years as a nation, when I talk about the U.S., but also other countries in the world. And to say that we'd be able to do the same with North Korea, it seems very difficult. We've not been able to stop North Korea from developing nuclear weapons, not been able to stop them from launching missiles. So this is just another thing that represents the scope of the North Korean threat, and that really motivates the need for some sort of agreement, some sort of deal that would disincentivize illicit behaviors by lifting sanctions. But of course, we'd have to have a mutual compliance with that from the North Korean side as well.
All right, good points there. Daniel, let me come to you now. According to some experts, I mean, it is becoming obvious that South Korea has no clear way to counter the North's leverage when it comes to nukes. And the North is aware of this leverage it has over South Korea. Perhaps that is why it keeps engaging in illegal actions.
Well, the previous speakers mentioned the state, and I think we have to remember that the state and all policies are actually run by the party. So the Korean Workers' Party is a centralized dictatorship under the control of the Kim family regime. It's now under the third generation of Kim family rule. All of the political projects, all of the political agenda, all of the state projects are guided by the senior leadership, Kim Jong-un, and the small Politburo or the presidium of the Politburo. So about 4 or 5 people deliberate the policies, and then they are able to marshal all of the resources within the state and within the economy and allocate those resources towards their pet projects. So for the senior leadership, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, their delivery systems, these are of most importance because of their worldview. We could spend a lot of time talking about that, but just accept that. We see it in their behavior and in their actions. So they can access resources at their disposal. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea has a large trade deficit, about $1 billion a year. They have food shortages for a number of reasons, for misallocation and poor policy. Nevertheless, with this trade deficit and this current account deficit, the regime has looked to ways to acquire hard currency to balance that deficit. They can't go to the IMF for loans. They don't have foreign direct investment. They get some aid from China, but they've looked to illicit activities, whether it's smuggling, and now cyber crimes have provided a way for the regime to gain hard currency to fund their pet projects.
Okay.
And of course, the most important one is the nuclear program.
Okay, Philip, let me come to you now. The crypto market is extremely volatile. I think we can all agree on that, right? So if, assuming the crypto market crashes completely, does that mean North Korea's economy is going to cripple? And if so, what alternatives does North Korea have to somehow try to reinforce its economy again?
Well, it would hurt it, but only in the short term. Everyone says the crypto market is very volatile, and it is if you're looking at things, from a short term, a month by month, or at the moment, because we're in a particularly bad bit, over a year basis. But if you look at it over a 5-year or 10-year basis, and you're looking at some of the more popular coins that are out there, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all the rest of it, they have been on a massive growth, and they're still on the path for that. And there's always been a recovery. The biggest issue comes whenever you get all the little altcoins that are trying to get on the back of everything that's going on, and those are extremely volatile, and many have got no legs on them whatsoever. And North Korea is already doing things to try and build up its reserves. It's increasing its relationship with Russia. Now, from a cyber perspective, there are only 2 internet pipelines into North Korea. One that's been there for a long time and is relatively low bandwidth, that's been supplied through China. The relationship with China, the aid North Korea gets from China, has always been there. And it's China can use it as a plausibly deniable little bad boy in the region to stir things up as it needs. But there's been a relatively recent, in the last sort of 5 to 7 years, large bandwidth pipeline put in by Russia, by the Russian State Railway Company. And interestingly, as that was put in, North Korea's missile program went from being 8 times out of 10 unsuccessful with low-range missiles to becoming 9.5 times out of 10 successful with very long-range missiles. A coincidence?
Right. I mean, let me add one more question there. While most of the world is united against North Korea's nuclear program, certainly there are countries, for example, like China and Russia, which have taken a rather unusual stance. For example, China and Russia refused to sign on to a statement condemning the proliferation of North Korea's missile launches. And about a few days ago, President Putin said that he wants to reinforce Russia's bilateral ties with North Korea. So my question is, Philip, to what extent do you think countries like China and Russia have emboldened Kim Jong-un?
Oh, massively, absolutely massively indeed. And the payback for China and Russia is they've got a plausibly deniable outlet for them to continue to threaten the stabilization of the region as they need to, and for their own, to prosecute their own cyber attacks if they want to do that, and just blame this despot dictator and this regime. So there's a much more complex relationship going on between all of them, and that relationship between China, Russia, and North Korea will ensure that North Korea will always remain useful to the two bigger partners.
Tom, what's in there for Russia and China?
Well, in there for Russia and China is just yet another ally they can use as they both feel pressure from the West. We've seen a stark uptick in tensions with the U.S. between the U.S. and Russia and U.S. and China, and we've seen a stark uptick in relations between Russia and China in recent years. We've seen joint military exercises, joint economic activities, and for a long time this was dismissed by a lot of Western experts as just a marriage of convenience. But the complexity and layers of this relationship has only prospered really in over the past very recent years, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere, especially now at a time, if we just look at the current geopolitical situation with the war in Ukraine going on, which China has not backed specifically, but has also not come out to condemn. It's trying to take a neutral stance, but is still willing to do business with Russia. And then we look at the Taiwan tension. We've seen Russia taking a much more enthusiastic expressive view against the U.S. When it comes to the Taiwan issue and support of the Chinese. And we see North Korea now in the middle of this in a rather precarious economic situation. North Korea in past years has done a rather apt job of trying to play the powers against themselves, but now it sees two neighbors essentially who are in conflict with the West in one way or another, and it sees that it can try to gain for itself. And with Russia, I think it could use as many friends it can get. With China, it wants that buffer zone with the other U.S. allies in the Asia Pacific. So whereas I think I was mentioned before, Russia and China joined that consensus against North Korea having nuclear weapons. Now it seems like somewhat of a useful ally to have in the fight.
Okay, Daniel, let me get your thoughts on this.
Well, I think in many respects, the countries that we were talking about, Russia, China, and North Korea, they have grievances about the international system. Their grievances, sometimes they converge, but often they diverge. They're dissatisfied with the status quo. Of course, North Korea is dissatisfied with Korean division and aspects of the international system. China, of course, is dissatisfied with Taiwan and the situation in the Taiwan Strait. In Moscow, Putin would like to overturn NATO and the EU and so forth. So they have grievances about the U.S.-led international world order. And so in some respects, they'd like to undermine that or replace it with something. But while I think they have these common grievances as far as a common vision going forward, then I think it begins to diverge. They have different goals and they don't necessarily have common interests or values other than opposing the current status quo.
Okay. Now, I want to move forward and broaden the discussion a bit. The conflict in Korea between the North and the South has been going for decades now. And every year we hear about reconciliation talks, peace talks. In fact, there was a massive effort by former U.S. President Donald Trump, which many hailed across the world. But even that effort has not produced any significant results. And I mean, many experts believe that if the conflict is not brought to an end, like Connor said earlier, this is going to keep happening. North Korea is going to keep finding ways to fund its nuclear program. So, Philip, let me ask you, what would bring this to an end? What would be a lasting solution?
Well, I think it's one that's not going to happen quickly. It would be the end of the Kim dynasty in North Korea. I think whilst the Kim dynasty continues with its dictatorship, it can't bring a normality and a normal relationship back with South Korea again, because as soon as it would see that as polluting its ability to retain control over its people, as soon as it allows its people to try and move out elsewhere. And therefore, it suits
if I may,
Kim Jong-un.
I just want to make sure I get this right. So you are saying that sanctions are going to remain on the North as long as Kim Jong-un is there?
As long as there's a dictatorship running North Korea, I think that's the only way
So
to
you
put
don't
pressure.
you don't see any way to
maintain-
convince Kim Jong-un to not do what he's doing?
No, I don't think so, because he is a little man with a lot of power, and he's got a lot of power because he's got a big stick over his people. As soon as he starts to allow the freedoms to come back into the country, like any other dictatorship that's happened in history, and people realize what's going on, it'll start to generate insurrection within the country and start to threaten his regime and his leadership. And that will lead to more violence against the people initially, but potentially then the overthrow of his regime. He'll never let that happen. And that's why it'll stay as it is until something happens to cause the end of his dynasty. And the only two countries that could influence it, China could influence it and put a lot of pressure on and bring it into China. But again, as has been highlighted, there are real political differences between China and North Korea, and China probably doesn't want North Korea as part of it. And again, with Russia, Russia and China got involved with North Korea because it's a buffer between the American piece in South Korea and China and elsewhere. So it's a very, very difficult and almost unresolvable position.
Now, Tom, U.S. President Joe Biden, former U.S. President Donald Trump was someone who was able to influence Kim Jong-un to come to a negotiating table, right? Do you think President Biden can do the same?
I just recently came back from South Korea, and it's easy, I think, for us to look at the North Korean conflict as the inter-Korean conflict, I should say, as a frozen one, one that really doesn't have a lasting solution. But if you're on the ground in Seoul or other parts, or go to the DMZ like I did, you see how alive the conflict really is, and how there is a lot of hope, I think, in South Korea that there could be some sort of solution. Now, I think we have to sit back and separate for a second the idea of unification, which is something that both Koreas still very much officially believe is the path forward, and a peace agreement, which I think is a much more attainable thing. What we've seen differently from the Trump administration to the Biden administration is because of the peace talks having unraveled under Trump, Kim Jong-un is much less willing to just come to the table for the sake of coming to the table and get those photo ops, as is President Biden for his part. So there would have to be some sort of substantive arrangement ahead of any sort of agreement, any sort of summit. But I think that the political capital should be spent somewhat toward this end, because there is I think, willingness on the Korean Peninsula, both sides of it, to at least have a peace deal, because that doesn't necessarily mean that North Korea changes its tune, that it gives up its nuclear weapons, but it's something that seems to be a win for all sides, including the U.S., because President Biden can walk away with a foreign policy victory. Now, it doesn't seem that the North Koreans right now are especially willing to talk. Ever since the pandemic, there's been somewhat of a withdrawal, a retreat from dialogue at all. So I think that there needs to, of course, be a willingness established by all sides to do this. But President Biden would have to, I think, want to really spend that diplomatic capital, because the South Koreans haven't necessarily seen a persistent effort. They've seen it on China. They've seen a counter-China narrative, but they've not seen a persistence and a commitment necessarily to want to engage on this issue, perhaps because there's a fear of failure.
Okay. Now, Daniel, let me come to you. You know, they say in foreign policy, if there is political will, there's always a diplomatic solution out there. Tell me, do you think the U.S., as a superpower, has the political will right now, given all the problems that are going on in the world, to resolve the issue between the North and the South?
Well, first of all, I disagree with your premise. You said there's always a diplomatic solution. Sometimes there is deadlock. Sometimes there's no bargaining space. Sometimes there's no deal to be had. So even when countries are at war, countries may be engaged in deadly conflict, or they seek to eliminate another state or another people, there's not a diplomatic solution at hand. So that's why they engage in conflict. So even in that case, when there's conflict, you still have to maintain some kind of communication channel, some kind of diplomatic contact. And in this case, the situation we're in right now in the Korean Peninsula, it's important to avoid miscalculation and deal with misperception and those types of problems, because the outbreak of any conflict could be so deadly. It's something we want to avoid. So the two Koreas disagree on almost everything. I would say they're in this zero-sum rivalry. I mean, they agree on avoiding war, possibly, or at least today that's the case. Time zones, up until a couple years ago, North Korea changed its time zones, and we're a half hour off. They couldn't even agree on time zones. They disagree over words. They can't even agree on the name of the country. They have two different or separate names for Korea. So unless there's some change in the orientation of North Korea, and let's face it, North Korea is the outlier state. So does the rest of the world adjust to Korea's idea, or North Korea's idea of governance and social organization and all of those things, or should North Korea adjust? I think North Korea has to do more adjusting than the rest of the world. Of course, we can compromise and do some things to adjust, but without any changes in North Korea, I think we can remain in this deadlock for quite a while.
Daniel, I'll have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Philip, Daniel, Tom, thanks very much for talking to us here on The Newsmakers, and thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.